The smell of mildew and old money hit me the moment I stepped into the family estate. My father, Richard, didn't stand up. He didn't ask how I was. He simply slid a single sheet of paper across the mahogany table. It wasn't a greeting. It was a bill of sale. Divorce my husband, Gabriel. Marry his 60-year-old creditor. Wipe out his $15 million debt. He leaned forward, his eyes dead cold, and said the words that finally killed the last bit of hope I had. I made you. I own you. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I reached into my bag, pulled out a red folder, and placed it gently between us. Before I tell you what was in that red folder and how I made my father regret the day he was born, drop a comment. Where are you watching from right now? I want to see how far the truth travels. To understand why that red folder was so heavy, you have to understand the silence that filled the room. 5 years. That is exactly how long it had been since Richard last spoke to me without a lawyer present. The last time I stood in this room, I was 27, begging him to walk me down the aisle. He didn't just say no. He looked at Gabriel, the man who is now my husband, and called him trash. He told me that if I married a man who grew up in public housing, I was scrubbing the Ashford name off my skin. He cut me off without a dime, revoked my access to the family trust, and told security to escort me off the property. He thought that would break me. He thought I would come crawling back when the credit card bills hit. But Richard made a critical error in his calculation. He assumed my competence came from his money. He didn't realize that while he was busy inheriting an empire, I was busy learning how to build one. For 5 years, while Richard sat in this decaying mansion in the Hamptons, selling off the silver candlesticks one by one just to buy vintage wine, Gabriel and I were grinding. We started in a basement apartment in Queens that smelled like damp earth and ambition. We didn't have inheritance. We had leverage. We bought our first distressed duplex with a hard money loan that had an interest rate that would make a shark blush. We renovated it ourselves because we couldn't afford contractors. I laid tile until my hands bled. Gabriel did the electrical work until 3 in the morning. We flipped it, took the profit, and bought 2 more, then 4, then a city block. While Richard was busy pretending he was still a king, we built a portfolio worth $850 million. I drive a 4-year-old sedan. I don't wear logos. You wouldn't know I could buy this entire neighborhood in cash just by looking at me. But Richard, he still wears bespoke suits he hasn't paid for in a decade. He looks at me and still sees a stupid little girl who needs his permission to exist. He thinks I came to dinner tonight because I missed him. He thinks I'm here because his summons scared me. He is delusional. I didn't drive 3 hours in traffic to negotiate a marriage contract to a 60-year-old creditor. I didn't come here to save the Ashford legacy. I came because 3 days ago, my forensic accountant flagged a notification on my credit report. Suspicious activity. Someone had tried to open a 7-figure line of credit using my old social security number, the one linked to the family estate. The IP address came from inside this house. Richard didn't invite me here to reconnect. He invited me here because he had already started stealing my identity. And he needed to manipulate me into legalizing the theft before the bank caught on. He wanted me to marry his creditor not just to wipe out his debt, but to cover his tracks. I looked at him across the table. He was swirling his wine, looking smug, waiting for me to cry or beg or argue about why I shouldn't have to divorce my husband. He thought we were having a family dispute. He didn't realize he was sitting across from a CEO who was about to audit him out of existence. I tapped the red folder with my index finger. I'm not here to negotiate. Richard, I'm here to foreclose. Richard didn't even open the folder. He just laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It was the deep, a resonant sound of a man who has never been told no in his entire life. He poured himself another glass of wine, splashing a little on the tablecloth, and looked at me with genuine amusement. He told me I was adorable. He said I was playing dress-up, pretending to be a shark when I was really just a goldfish in a tank he owned. Then my sister, Ashley, chimed in. She was sitting to his right, picking at her salad, wearing a tennis bracelet she definitely hadn't paid for. She looked at me with that familiar mix of pity and disgust she'd perfected in high school. She asked if the handyman put me up to this. She meant Gabriel. She called my husband, the lead architect for the new city library and the man who designed the luxury high-rise she was currently living in. A handyman. She didn't even know. She lived in a building with his name on the cornerstone, and she still thought he fixed sinks for a living. I didn't correct her. Correction implies you care about their opinion. I just watched them. It was fascinating, in a clinical sort of way. Like watching a nature documentary, where the prey has no idea the predator is already in the room. They were so comfortable in their arrogance. They honestly believed that because they shared my DNA, they held the copyright to my life. Richard stopped laughing when he realized I wasn't joining in. His face shifted from amusement to that dark, purple rage I remembered from childhood. He leaned over the table, the veins in his neck bulging against his silk collar. He told me that if I walked out of that door without signing the marriage contract, he would destroy me. He laid out his plan with terrifying precision. He wasn't just going to disown me again. He was going to dismantle my reputation. He said he had friends at the major financial journals. He would leak stories claiming I was mentally unstable, that I was embezzling from my own company to fund a drug habit, that I was abusing him in his old age. He said he would paint me as the ungrateful, predatory daughter trying to kill her sick father for inheritance. He knew exactly what a scandal like that would do to my stock price. He knew my board would panic. He was threatening to burn down the empire I built just to warm his hands. He stood up, slamming his fist onto the table, so hard the silverware rattled. He screamed that this was his house. He screamed that he was the patriarch, the head of the Ashford line, and that I existed to serve the family interest. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that my autonomy was an illusion he had allowed, and now he was revoking it. He demanded I obey him. He demanded I submit. He stood there, panting, chest heaving, waiting for me to crumble. He expected the little girl who used to cry when he raised his voice. He expected the daughter who begged for his approval, but he was shouting at a ghost. I looked at this man, this red-faced stranger who claimed to own me, and I didn't feel fear. I felt a cold, sharp pity. He was screaming about being a king, completely unaware that he was standing in a castle made of sand, and the tide had already come in. I watched Richard pace the room, his voice echoing off the peeling wallpaper, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to shrink. I felt like a scientist observing a specimen under glass. The fear that had defined my childhood, the desperate need to be good enough, to be smart enough, to be worthy of his attention evaporated. In its place, a cold, clinical clarity settled over me. This wasn't a father trying to guide a wayward daughter. This was a panicked investor realizing his portfolio was about to crash. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I finally understood the mechanics of his toxicity. It's a specific kind of madness, isn't it? The delusion of power in an empty wallet. Richard stood there in a suit he couldn't afford, in a house that was rotting around him, screaming demands as if he still held the deed to the universe. He truly believed that biology was a binding contract. He thought that because he contributed genetic material 32 years ago, he held a controlling interest in my existence. He didn't see a person sitting across from him. He saw a diversified asset class he could liquidate to cover his margin calls. He had spent decades convincing himself that his authority was a natural resource, an endless well he could draw from whenever he needed to feel big. But authority isn't a birthright. It's a currency. You have to earn it. You have to maintain it. Richard had spent his authority like a drunk sailor for 20 years on cruelty, on neglect, on the sheer arrogance of assuming I would always be there to foot the bill. Now, he was reaching into his pocket to pay for his survival, and he was shocked to find nothing but lint and dust. He confused fear with respect. He confused silence with submission. And most tragically, he confused being a father with being an owner. He thought he could trade my happiness for his solvency because, in his ledger, I was never a human being. I was just an insurance policy he had forgotten to pay the premiums on. The anger I had carried for 5 years, the hot, suffocating rage began to cool. It didn't disappear. It just hardened into something useful. It turned into pity. Not the warm kind of pity you feel for a wounded animal, but the cold, a distant pity you feel for a gambler who thinks the next hand will fix everything. Even as the house lights are turning off, he finally stopped shouting, his chest heaving, his face slick with sweat. He looked at me, expecting to see the terror he had planted in me as a child. He expected me to be breaking down, to be signing the contract just to make the noise stop. Instead, I took a sip of my water. I placed the glass down on the table with a soft clink that sounded louder than any of his screams. "Are you finished?" I asked. My voice was quiet, steady, and completely void of the emotion he was desperate to provoke. Richard blinked, thrown off rhythm. "What?" "I asked if you were finished." I repeated. "Because you've spent the last 10 minutes listing all the ways you own me, but you forgot to check the paperwork." I reached for the red folder again. The time for analysis was over. It was time to close the deal. "You talk a lot about legacy, Richard, about what you're owed, but you never actually read the fine print of the legacy you claim to protect." I flipped the folder open. The sound of the crisp paper turning was the only noise in the room. And unfortunately for you, I did. I pulled the document from the folder. It wasn't a check. It wasn't a marriage contract. It was a brittle, yellowed document dated 20 years ago, the last will and testament of Eleanor Ashford. Richard scoffed. "I know what it says. She left the house to me. I'm her only son. She left you the use of the house, Richard." I corrected, my voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. "There is a massive legal difference between a fee-simple ownership and what she actually gave you." I slid the document toward him, pointing to paragraph 4. "Grandmother Eleanor knew you. She knew you were a spender. She knew that if she gave you the title, you would mortgage this place to the hilt to fund your lifestyle, and the Ashford legacy would be sold off at a foreclosure auction within a decade. So she didn't give you the house. She gave you a life estate." Richard squinted at the paper, his arrogance faltering for the first time. "It means I live here until I die." "It's the same thing." "It is not the same thing," I said. "A life estate grants you the right to live on the property?" "Yes, but it comes with a strict fiduciary duty to the remainder man, the person who actually owns the title and takes possession after your death." I tapped my chest. "Me. I am the remainder man. Richard, I have been since I was 12 years old." He looked at me, his mouth slightly open. "So I'm still alive. You can't touch me." That brings us to New York property law. Section 801, I said, reciting the statute I had memorized weeks ago. It's called the doctrine of waste. It is a legal concept designed to protect the future owner from a current tenant who treats the property like a piggy bank instead of a home. The law states that if a life tenant commits waste, if they damage the property, fail to pay taxes, or strip the assets for cash, their interest in the property is automatically voided. It's not a warning. It's an eviction clause. I pulled out a second stack of photos from the folder. I had a surveyor drone fly over the estate last week. The slate roof on the east wing has collapsed because you refused to fix a leak in 2019. That is permissive waste. But here is the voluntary waste. I laid out photos of the gutted house, missing copper pipes, Tiffany windows, and marble fireplaces. You stripped the estate to pay a gambling debt. You sold the fixtures. You destroyed the asset. Ashley stared at the images, realizing her inheritance had already been sold for scrap. You broke the covenant, I said. Under New York law, your life estate is terminated. Possession reverts immediately. Richard went pale. I'm your father. You're a tenant who violated the lease, I replied, cornered. He faked a heart attack, clutching his chest, collapsing, knocking over a crystal decanter. Ashley screamed and called 911, accusing me of killing him. Paramedics rushed him out. As he passed me, his eyes opened cold, furious, acting. 2 hours later, my phone exploded with alerts. Ashley was live streaming from the hospital, through tears. She accused me of forcing Richard to sign over the deed, abusing him, forging documents, and trying to kill him for the inheritance. Richard backed her up, playing the frail victim. The internet turned instantly. Elder abuser, monster, criminal. They had lost legally. So they went. Scorched earth, destroy my reputation, my company, my life. They forgot one thing. I owned the house, and landlords install security. I downloaded the unedited 4K footage from the dining room cameras and uploaded it as the truth. The video showed Richard healthy, screaming about needing money, winking at Ashley, and throwing himself to the floor to fake the attack. The narrative collapsed in minutes. When deputies arrived later, there were no cameras, just paperwork. Richard was arrested for filing a false police report and misuse of emergency services. Ashley followed, sobbing, clutching whatever she could carry. I'm your father, Richard whispered. You traded your daughter for money, I said. Now you have neither. The next morning, in my own home, my phone kept buzzing. Mom was calling not to apologize, but to negotiate bail and reputation. I didn't answer. Family isn't a debt you owe forever. Sometimes, survival means refusing to pay the blood tax. I blocked the number. The silence returned. My coffee tasted like freedom. If you're holding on to someone because of biology alone, ask yourself, is it love or is it a hostage situation?